Hello, everyone. My name is Liz Fear, and welcome to the final installment of Haskalah's 10-part continuing education series on Reconstructing Judaism. Today, we'll be learning about Abraham Joshua Heschel, along with Mordecai Kaplan, their effect on 20th century Judaism, which could be a course in and of itself, but this is a taste. And we'll be led by Rabbi Steve Nathan. If you've missed any of our earlier classes, I'll be putting a link to the recordings on YouTube in the chat, as well as a link to sign up for our emails and a link to donate to the cost of putting on today's class. We appreciate any contribution you can make, even if it's just your presence here today. If you'd like me to email you these links instead, just message me your email address in the chat. We ask everyone to stay muted throughout unless you're speaking, and you can also use the raise hand function or the chat box to ask questions. Closed captioning is enabled. I'll put instructions to it in the chat. Please keep in mind it is imperfect, especially with Hebrew. This meeting is being recorded, and if you wish not to be seen while speaking, remember to turn off your video in advance, and all that will be shown is your screen name. And now I'll hand it over to Rabbi Nathan.
Hello, everybody. Good to see everyone. Some familiar faces and names, and some not familiar. Actually, if you want to put in the chat, rather than going around, it'll just be a little bit easier if you just want to put where you are, so we can just get a sense of where folks are at the moment. Physically, that is. Emotionally, psychologically, yeah, we can put that in too if you want to. So let me see here. We've got Port St. Lucie. Okay. Great, we've got people all over the place. I'm in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And so I am a graduate of the Reconstructionist Medical College, and I do lead services and do teach adult ed once a month at Haskalah, and I'm also my primary job is the director of Jewish student life and associate chaplain at Lehigh University in Bethlehem. So thank you all. Actually, if you can raise your hand, if either for real or if you're not, if your camera's not on, you can use the raise hand function. If you were at our first session about Abraham Joshua Heschel last month. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, I knew a bunch of you were. So as Liz said, this could easily be, well, Heschel alone, Kaplan alone, Heschel and Kaplan together. Each of those are a course into themselves. So this is really, in Yiddish, a Vorspeise, a little appetizer, a little taste of the two. So this whole series has been on Reconstructing Judaism, and the last session was specifically on Heschel, because even though he was not a Reconstructionist, Heschel had a great impact on American Judaism in the 20th century, including through his connection with Mordecai Kaplan. And I'm not going to be looking specifically just at Kaplan this time, but sort of the relationship between the two, as well as some of their teachings that and how they related to each other. But I will, I'll give a little, hold on, let me go back. There we go, gallery view, there we go. I'll give a little bio of Kaplan. I did give a bio of Heschel the last time, just to remind you that Heschel came from a long line of Hasidic rabbis in Poland, was ordained there, went to Berlin, has his PhD, wrote specifically on the prophets, was a rabbi and a philosopher and a teacher in Berlin, came over just in time before the Holocaust in 1939, and then did the rest of his writing and teaching in America until his death in 1972, and we saw the video of him the last time. So Kaplan is very different, and yet not. And so he was born. I have two screens going here, so if you see me moving back and forth, that's why. So he was born in 1889 in Lithuania. His father was a rabbi. He immigrated here fairly young, in 1895, at the age of, let's see, 89 to 95. Well, no, he was born in 83. He emigrated in 89. Sorry. Um, he started City College in New York in 1895. Then 1890, but also 1893 to 1902, he studied at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, the conservative movement rabbinical school where Heschel was later going to teach. He also went to Columbia University, studying philosophy, sociology, and education, and received a master's degree and a doctorate. Majoring in philosophy, he wrote his major thesis, his magnum opus, I would say, on Judaism as Civilization in 1936. He was ordained a rabbi he was ordained as an Orthodox rabbi, even though he studied at Jewish Theological Seminary. His first congregation was Kehilat Jeshurun in New York, which was Orthodox. And he was also one of the co-founders of the Young Israel movement of modern Orthodoxy in America. And he was really one of the leaders, if not the primary leader, of creating the Jewish community center movement in America. He had this idea, and it came out in Judaism as Civilization, of, again, if Judaism was a civilization, not just a religion, you needed the idea of a community center to gather. And now many of those were also synagogues. For instance, Brit Shalom in Bethlehem, in its original incarnation on the south side, right off of Lehi's campus, was a synagogue. It was the proverbial shul with a pool, as was Beth Shalom in Elkins Park, aka the Frank Lloyd Wright shul, and others. So this idea that either a synagogue, Jewish community center combined, or just the idea of having a Jewish community center, all really came from Kaplan's thought. And then he founded the Society for the Advancement of Judaism, which was the name of the rather unique name of his synagogue in New York City. That was founded in 1922, which is the same year his daughter Judith Kaplan, later Eisenstein, became the first bat mitzvah in America. He believed very much in equality among, in terms of the sexes, and how much of that was driven by the fact that he had 4 daughters. I'm sure that definitely was a part of it, but not, because there were plenty of other rabbis before him who had only daughters, who didn't do what he did. So in 1922, Judy was became a bat mitzvah. She did not read from the Torah. She read the Haftorah, but she did help lead the services. And so at the anniversary of that in let's see, it wasn't the 100th, it was the 70th anniversary. She talked about, she had the tradition of having a bar mitzvah when you're 83, a second bar mitzvah. So she had a second bat mitzvah when she was 83. And she talked about that. And you can look through the archives of the Reconstructionist movement and elsewhere, and you can see her talking about it. She said, lightning didn't strike. It was no huge, it was just what she was doing and what her father believed in. So the Society for the Advancement of Judaism is a rather strange name for synagogue. As I said, it still exists on the Upper West Side. Lauren Gribel Herman is the current rabbi. And, really where that came from is the Society for Ethical Humanism. That's kind of where the name came from, because which was also, again, mother church, if you want to call it that. Was also on the Upper West Side, so he was very much influenced by that idea of ethical humanism, but applying that to religion, and to a belief, including the belief in God, and combining that with Judaism, which is sort of where he got this idea of society for the advancement of Judaism, as opposed to the advancement of ethical humanism. And he wrote a number of books. Again, the magnum opus being Judaism as Civilization, and all of his books were focused on that idea, the idea that Judaism is a civilization. He defined Judaism as the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people. Now, let's parse that for a second. So the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people. Key there first is evolving, reconstructing, not reforming, in that they're not let's get rid of things that external trappings that don't make sense to us anymore, which was sort of the origins of reform. Not conserving in the same way that the conservative movement did, which was about maintaining that traditional halachic Jewish legal structure, but adapting to meet the needs of the time, but still being bound by halakha as Jewish law, but rather reconstructing. So it was evolving, and I think the idea of Judaism as revolving civilization certainly is underlying Reform, conservative, and even modern Orthodoxy in America. Kaplan had a huge effect. I remember one time hearing a student talking at Hebrew Union College, the Reform movement, and he was talking about the power of the past and tradition and the evolving nature of Judaism, and he said, well, we always like to say in the Reform movement that the past has a vote but not a veto. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, if you're going to quote, you need to get it right. That was Mordecai Kaplan, 1936. It's you can certainly use it because I think it applied. Kaplan didn't want a separate movement. He wanted his philosophy to really inform all of the Jewish world at the time, and it really did. That's sort of a case in point. So, but that was really important, that the past had a vote but not a veto. That's certainly true in the Reform movement now more than back then. But in the conservative movement, there's still the sense that the past, the tradition does have veto power, even though there's flexibility compared to, say, the Orthodox world. And even the modern Orthodox world, though, also believe that to a certain extent. As I said, Kaplan really started off in the modern Orthodox world. So, back to his definition, the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people. So, it was not just simply a civilization like American civilization, but it was a religious civilization. So it was based on the center of it, so it was based on religious belief and practice, but the center of it, and it's always referred to as his Copernican revolution, he's, as opposed to, the sun revolving around the Earth and sun thing, that we revolve around the sun, not vice versa, that it's not God at the center, it's the Jewish people at the center. And the Jewish religion, the religious civilization, comes from the needs and the practices of the Jewish people. That was his biggest chidush, his biggest, I can't think of the word. What's the word? His all I can think of is the Hebrew for it, which is chidush, which is sort of his new thing. There's a word that I'm trying to think of in English. And sorry, I'm packing to go to Israel as soon as we're done here, so my mind's a little famished at the moment. I'm not packing at the moment. I was packing before I came here. Don't worry, I cannot multitask that well and hide it from you. So again, the Jewish people are at the center. So it's religious, constantly evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people. So peoplehood is at the center. And if you look at Reconstructionism, and Kaplan also used to like to talk about the three B's: behaving, belonging, and believing. That in the traditional Jewish world, including the conservative, behaving was at the center, Jewish law and behavior. In the Reform movement, it was believing. It was believing in the divine and believing in the prophetic nature of Judaism. But for Kaplan, the starting point was belonging. They were all there. They were all important. An exercise I used to love to do with kids is giving them an orange with toothpicks, and if they only have 2 toothpicks instead of 3, it wouldn't not an orange, but clementine. If you only have 2 instead of 3, it sort of topples over. So all 3 were important. It's just one's maybe a little bit longer than the other. So belonging was the most important thing for Kaplan, even though behaving and believing were also important parts. But if you look at Judaism in general, belief is always the least. I want to be careful how I say this. The least central of the 3, until the Reform movement, because the Reform movement in its early days, got rid of so much of the practice, that they really focused on the belief and the prophetic message, which is something Heschel talked about a lot, the importance of the prophets. But they didn't. The belief, in another way, though, is the least important, because as opposed to Christianity, you don't have to profess a specific belief in order to be Jewish. Maimonides in the 14th century was sort of forced into creating his 13 principles of belief because people were saying that he was a heretic and didn't believe in certain things. But until then, there was really if you're Catholic and you have the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed or something like that, we don't have anything like that. The closest thing we have maybe is the Shema, and all that basically says is we believe in one God, or that God is one. He really focused on the belonging piece. But within that, then what made him different in spite of that was his belief system. He was a philosopher. So, in traditional sense, if you look at Heschel, he spoke very much in traditional Jewish language about the prophets and about practice and about community. Now, both men were totally traditionally observant in their personal lives. That's really important to remember. Kaplan and Heschel were both, if you were to look at them, you would say they were Orthodox Jews if you just were basing it on their practice. Ira Eisenstein, who took over, so with Kaplan there was Ira Eisenstein, and then there was his son-in-law. There was Kaplan, there was his son-in-law, Ira Eisenstein. There was also Eugene Cohen, and they were the 3 sort of primary thinkers and writers of the Reconstructionist movement, often jokingly referred to as the Father, the Son-in-law, and the Holy Ghost writer. Because Cohen did often try to... Kaplan was a wonderful writer, but he was not a great editor of his own work. And often he was his own editor, which is, if anybody here is a writer, you should never be your own editor. But there were times Cohen and Eisenstein, I think, helped sort of reshape Kaplan in a way that became more easily accessible. But so you did have them writing about, there was a theological underpinning to Reconstructionism, which was transnaturalism. We had supernaturalism, which was the traditional way of looking at God, and Heschel talked about a personal relationship with God. God in search, if you remember, for those of you who saw, God in search of, I'm going to use his language, God in search of man, that God needs us, which therefore implies that that there is this actual relationship, but then we're also in search of God, and God is this supernatural being that acts in the universe, even if we don't always understand it, which is a very traditional way of looking at it. Kaplan So the other way of looking things was naturalism, just sort of like almost like everything in nature is God, or um, it's really just about, yeah, it's almost like worshiping nature, in a way. I mean, that's an oversimplification of it, but transnaturalism extended that. Um, he would say that it reaches out also into the area of our mind, our personality, our purposes, our ideals, our values, and our meanings, which are not necessarily part of naturalism, which is a little bit more scientific. But he studied Dewey. He was really a student of Dewey's work, which was really more about naturalism. We're not going to go into him in detail, but he took that and then made it more of a religious version, which he called transnaturalism. That used simile and metaphor and poetry and mythology and drama, as a way to as a way to express the their relationship to the divine and how God operates in the world. Hold on one second. Sorry, just lost my place there. So transnaturalistic religion, he would say, beholds God in the fulfillment of human nature and not in the suspension of the natural order. So this supernatural would say God is about the suspension of natural order. Naturalism would say it's all about nature, and transnaturalism says that God is really what fulfills human nature in some way. So the one way of looking at it is supernaturalism is saying that God acts for us or upon us, sort of like we're the pieces on the chessboard. Naturalism, in a way, says, okay, so we're just moving the pieces around the chessboard, and that's how it is. And transnaturalism is saying that there is something that works through us that enables us to move the pieces on the chessboard. Again, that's an oversimplification of it. So he finds supernaturalism no longer meaningful, but he also finds naturalism lacking, and so he comes up with this term of transnaturalism, and yet people will often say that Kaplan is a naturalist, which he would deny at this point in time. So, but really his philosophy and his theology is a polemic against supernaturalism, in which God is not subject to any empirical laws of nature and can therefore suspend the natural order at any point in time. So in that way, in some ways, he even goes back to Maimonides and his Aristotelian or Neoplatonic, I always forget which one he was, sorry about that, way of looking at the world, that sort of God is the unmoved mover, that God can make things, but God sort of is set apart, set back, and doesn't make things happen specifically in the world, even though God has the power to. But what Kaplan would say is God doesn't really even have the power to, because God is the force, the power that makes for salvation, that makes salvation power possible. And when I'm talking about salvation, I'm not talking about the next world or at the end of times, even though that's part of traditional Jewish theology. It's salvation is making us and our world the best we can possibly be, and God is the power that allows for that to happen. The analogy I always use is we have the electrical current running through the house, right? We have the lamps, but if the lamps aren't plugged into the electrical current, they just sit there and look nice. That's how God is that power source, and we are the lamps. That we have the ability to bring light into the world, but we need something to give us that power, and that's sort of. Again, simplification, but I really like that analogy. And actually, Ira Eisenstein used a similar analogy, so I guess it works. I have so much material here to share. And I think what I'm going to do is if people if I say something that um, that you have a question about or something that you don't understand, just raise your hand. Liz, you'll keep an eye on things, and in case I'm rambling and I don't notice it, you'll let me know. Um, so um, I can share this too. But also, if you want to, Liz can share the whole document at some point. Liz, I'll share it with you right now, just so you'll have it, because it's really in the form of my notes, which is a lot of cutting and pasting from various sources. But I'll certainly share some of that with you here. Hold on a second. Du-du-du-du-du. Yep. Now I just lost all of you. Hold on. Now I come back. Sorry. Let me just turn that off again. Let me share. Oh, I know what. Okay, sorry. I know why it's not working on my end. Hold on. Excuse me for 1 second. All right. Now let me try this. All right. People can see that now? Yes? Okay, good. All right. And now I can see you also. Good. All right. So the basic difference between Kaplan and Heschel, and again, all of this is oversimplification. I'm not going to keep saying that. You just take that as the given here. So Kaplan's Judaism as civilization focuses on the reconstruction of the American Jewish life that would help the Jewish people to change their traditional way of life through incorporation of the modern way of life, philosophy, religion, and science as it develops in the U.S. So, really important. Kaplan was born in Lithuania, but he came over here very young, and as a very young man, and he is really the most American thinker in some ways within Judaism, I would say, or was in his time. Now, it's certainly been many since then. But Heschel, even though he was in America, didn't come over here. He did all of his training in Europe, and he came out of the Hasidic tradition. So that was a real difference. Kaplan came over here as a young man, was really influenced by the rise of rationalism in the United States, especially in the early 20th century. And his whole idea of Reconstruction was based on being an American Jew, which is one reason why it has Reconstructionism. I mean, it's the smallest movement anyway within Judaism, because, as I said, he didn't want it to be a movement. It wasn't until Ira Eisenstein finally convinced him in 1968 that when he was almost 100 years old, when Kaplan was almost 100 years old, Ira basically convinced him that, if we don't create a rabbinical school to train rabbis based on your teachings, your movement, this philosophy is going to die off with you. So he agreed to create the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, which in true Kaplanian fashion has continued to reconstruct itself through the years, often in ways that did not particularly thrill Ira Eisenstein. I will say that. Remembering, Ira died about 20 years ago, maybe. So, for instance, Kaplan as a stop share for or let me see. I can pause. Can't I pause share? There we go. Pause share. As a put. Okay. I was gonna make a cat joke about pause share, but I just said, I just did, didn't I? So, Kaplan was very much a rationalist. He was not a mystic at all, as opposed to, again, Heschel, who came from the Hasidic tradition, which was Hasidism was created to bring Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, to the masses. And again, that idea of communing with God and talking to God and personal relationship with an actual supernatural being was very much part of Kabbalah and Hasidism and mysticism. Kaplan taught against the opposite of that. So when Arthur Green, who was one of the leading experts in Hasidism in the country, in the world, became president of the Reconstructing Rabbinical College in the 1980s, which was a real coup on the one hand because he was an extremely well-known scholar, but Ira Eisenstein was not very happy with that because he was a mystic. And my way of looking at it, as someone who sort of considers himself to be a mystical Reconstructionist, is that is really keeping up with, it's really keeping with Kaplan's idea of that Judaism is constantly evolving and reconstructing itself. So in more recent years, we found a way to take the language of mysticism and incorporate it, I'll speak for myself, into my life without necessarily believing in the traditional theological underpinnings of mysticism. So I use the traditional language of mysticism, and I'd say a number of people do, as metaphor, much more as metaphor than, say, traditional mystic might, who really viewed it as the way the world operates. So when I say as a mystical point of view that our actions on earth affect the divine realm, that's just saying that for me, it's saying that our actions on earth somehow, butterfly effect maybe, affect everything in the universe in some way, whereas a mystic would say, no, actually you're bringing about the union of the male and female of the divine, and there really is this thing going on in heaven, as opposed to it being a metaphor. So again, I think that's really a very Kaplanian way of looking at it. I don't know if Kaplan would agree. Like I said, Eisenstein didn't. Heschel, on the other hand, would view it as, it's never clear to me, from my understanding of reading Heschel, is that he really did believe it, but did he? Or was it still just a very powerful metaphor for him? I mean, I remember one time being at a lecture by Arthur Green, and he was talking about the importance of revelation at Sinai and what that meant for us, and he was talking about it as if it was an actual historical event, and somebody said to him, who trained under Eisenstein, how can you be talking that way? You actually believe it happened? And again, I'm not saying believing or not believing it, that's up to you, your belief, okay? But this student of Kaplan and Eisenstein's was saying, how can you be talking about the importance of revelation at Sinai? It's all mythology. And I remember Art Green basically saying some form of, I'm speaking about it as if it really happened, because for me it did, even if it didn't actually factually happen. That's the power of metaphor. That's the power of mythology and religion. And so I think that is a very Kaplanian way of looking at it, whether or not Kaplan would have agreed with it.
Just to pop in for a sec,
Yes.
Deb posted a comment in the chat. Kaplan makes me think of Second Temple Judaism, when we almost lost the religion. I'm thinking of what really happened at Hanukkah.
Oh, good point. Good point. Thank you. So that was a reconstruction in a way, or again, because if you look at, so when the Second Temple so you're talking about after the Second Temple was destroyed? Yeah. Okay, so after the Second Temple was destroyed and Judaism had to recreate itself without a temple, it was a temple-based religion. So to take those practices and the underpinnings of them and somehow create new rituals, that prayer became sacrifice of the heart, etc. That's really what Reconstructionism is all about. It's not that the essence of the term, which I really didn't maybe make clear enough before, that it's not reforming, it's not conserving, but it's reconstructing. It's taking the tradition that we have, understanding how it developed, what its purpose was, what it was meant to do in our life, and say, okay, how do we reconstruct it? How do we reconstruct the tradition, the ritual, etc., to meet our needs today in 2021 America, to still have that same meaning, but it changes. And changes maybe that the practice might change, but it's keeping the same meaning. So, yeah, the Hanukkah story is a perfect example because we had the story of the Maccabees defeating the Greeks, which was really about the Maccabees defeating the Hellenistic Jews. It was really much more of a civil war than anything else in many ways. And then when the Maccabees won, they eventually became the Hasmonean dynasty, who were basically, in order to maintain their power, they were in bed with the Greeks and then in bed with the Romans, and eventually brought about the destruction of Jerusalem and the Second Temple. Again, oversimplification. But so that's why the story of Hanukkah began to focus on the the miracle of the oil, which we don't find anywhere until the Talmud, which is finished in the early 6th century. Never mentioned anywhere. There are all these mentions about the wars of the Maccabees in the books of the Maccabees. It's talked about a little bit in the Mishnah, but the idea of Hanukkah being based on this miracle of the oil does not occur until the 6th century. So, so that was really a reconstruction of Jewish practice in order to meet the needs of the time and in order to fit with sort of, in order to make things work for Jews in Babylonia and Israel in the 5th century. I'm sure it didn't come to be. I'm sure a version of it came to be before the beginning of the 6th century, but it was never written down until around then. So, resume share. There we go. All right. So, the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people, we talked about that. So, in religion, the religion that had been undergoing cultural, sorry, some of this didn't type right. So that things had been changing over time, but also felt that we needed to connect with other religions as well. I'm sorry, I really left some words out here. So Heschel, should say Abraham Joshua Heschel, not just Abraham Joshua, really focused specifically on the traditional mode of life, whereas Jewish life, whereas Kaplan was much more how do we fit in the American way of life and how do we connect with other religions and other people. Kaplan was about changing, reconstructing to fit the needs of the time, whereas Heschel was much more about maintaining the tradition, but, and this is a big but, making it meaningful. What Heschel saw, and when I first read Heschel, what really jumped out at me, and I was in high school, maybe early college when I read this, was that he was complaining about everything I complained about Judaism in the 60s and 70s. It had lost its meaning. It had moved out, he talked a lot about the synagogues moving out to the suburbs and becoming these sterile environments modeled after the more sterile Protestant churches in the area, losing their unique Jewish identity, people being much more concerned with the external trappings than what the meaning of it was, and that it was, really the sterilization of Judaism. Because if you look at the Hasidic world that Heschel came from, decorum was not something that existed. If anybody has ever gone to an Orthodox service, decorum is, in a Hasidic service especially, decorum isn't at the top of the list. People are all praying in their own way at different times, and if they're Hasidim, they might be dancing, they might be, it's cacophony in a way. Whereas, everything in America was very much modeled after the Germanic, now American Protestant church, and much more about decorum and civility and will everybody please rise? Will everybody please be seated? Will everybody please, that's where responsive readings come from, which I still don't like personally. I would much rather everybody read together or one person read. Responsive readings feel very forced to me, and I'll thank Arthur Green for that because he talked about that a lot. So, Kaplan Kaplan was very much also working against that as well. Even though he was not a mystic, even though it was still a much more rational or transnatural way of being, he was about trying to get people to connect to their Judaism but for him it was about you don't say or do something you don't believe in. Because he felt like a lot of people were abandoning Judaism because they didn't believe in the traditional language, they didn't believe in the traditional images, the traditional supernatural God. They didn't believe in Jews as the chosen people because that separates us from others, and America was about the melting pot, even though we know now it's a salad bowl, it's not a melting pot, but back then it was the melting pot. So he also very much was about how do you practice something that is meaningful to you? But what Heschel was saying was, no, that's not the way to do it either. It's really about the return to the more traditional way, but in a meaningful way. All right, so let me just see. So Kaplan believed that Judaism helped people to connect with the greater society, and Heschel was much more focused on Judaism helping Jews. But, always a but, as we know from the last time, he also saw that Jewish belief and practices led him to make the world a better place, which is why he was so heavily involved in the civil rights movement. Why he was good friends with Dr. King, why he protested against the Vietnam War. It wasn't as a way to connect with other people, but he saw the prophetic tradition within Judaism as saying, okay, you have to be fighting for and justice in the world for everyone. Even though it's coming from a specifically Jewish place. And he would say that God wants us to act that way and believe that in a literal sense, whereas Kaplan would say, godliness is, we got predicate theology, godliness is acting in this way. It's not that God is telling us to be just, but it's that justice is godliness. It's the godliness within us. So it's coming in from two different directions, and yet, in that case, the result is the same. But Heschel would say, the traditional religious practice is an important piece of this, but if you don't do that, still you have to do the important work. Kaplan would say it doesn't necessarily have to be the traditional religious practice. We can reconstruct the religious practice to meet the needs of the time. And it was Reconstructionism is a very much democratic approach. The rabbi is still seen as the facilitator and the educator, but not the ultimate authority figure, which often causes tension within synagogues. Because sometimes you do need an ultimate authority figure, and sometimes even Reconstructionist rabbis will say, you know what? This is what we should be doing. Now, the congregation might not listen, but that's often true in other movements as well. So it's definitely less a hierarchical way, whereas Heschel still had that hierarchical background that came from the Hasidic world, even though he was very much egalitarian in certain ways. And you can see a lot more about that in his, it's interesting. So his daughter Susanna, Dr. Susanna Heschel, talks a lot about the importance of his teachings. He only had daughters as well. Actually, I think he only had the one daughter. I'm just drawing a blank now. So each of them, and even though Ira Eisenstein was his disciple because his daughter couldn't become a rabbi back then. Actually, I will say that Judith Kaplan Eisenstein was one of the very first ethnomusicologists in anywhere. She had a doctorate in that. She really studied the ethnic background, Jewish music specifically, but not only Jewish music. So she was a well-known, world-renowned scholar of her own right, in her own right. All right, let me just see here okay. I'm going to stop for a second because I'm just moving along here because there's so much material. So any specific questions at this point? I usually like to be more interactive, but there's just so much stuff out there to cover. So I just want to make sure if there is something. Let me see. Oh, okay. So I see Deb here. Well, that's from before. The Septuagint of the Torah. So that was really more in the Greek world. That's a whole other. That's a different. So that's different than what I was thinking of when you brought up the Reconstructionism in the Greek world, and that's I'm not going to go into that right now, but that's certainly using the Septuagint, the translation as the Torah. Well, it was and it wasn't, but that's a whole. It is definitely. I would say that it definitely is a form of reconstruction as well. Although allowing idols in the temple was definitely not, I would say, not something that was ever acceptable, or should have ever been acceptable. But discussion for another time. So in terms of, let me just see here.
I just dropped a question in the chat too.
Okay.
Can you discuss more how Kaplan wanted Jews to join with other religions to form common religion?
Well, it wasn't. I mean, he did talk about, because he did see Judaism as unique, but he, rejected the notion of chosenness. First of all, because if you don't have a supernatural God, you can't have chosenness, because there's nobody there to choose us. So the idea of chosenness to him was something that came out of the Jewish people's desire to be, their sense of specialness, and having a unique purpose in the world. But also he felt it led to a sense of superiority and triumphalism. So he saw it more as a way of, okay, we have our own unique way of making the world a better place, but so do each religion has its own unique way. So, and he also talked about American civil religion, which is a whole other issue, because he was very much an American. So, talking about things like the July 4th and other things like that to him where he saw as civil religion. But so he wanted us to maintain our unique way of being in the world, our unique way of worshiping, our unique way of being a community, but also that shouldn't separate us from other people, and from other religions. Hold on, I'm looking for, there was a quote specifically that, so, I mean, I don't know if I'm not sure if that totally answers your question, but, so this idea that we still have that our connections to our religion, as part of our culture is important, but it should not separate us from others. I don't know if that totally makes sense, but that's how I view it. What I did want to, just looking at time here, so what I did want to look at now was there was an article that I read, which was a response to some questions by Mel Skult, who was Kaplan's was and is Kaplan's primary biographer, and so somebody asked him about the Heschel and Kaplan's influence on one another. And as he says it, rather than talk of influence, I'd rather talk of affinities and difficulties. You mentioned in your question about what's the influence, the obvious fact that we seem to have here the rational versus the mystical, the sociological mind versus the poetic. I mean, that's very central. Kaplan spoke as a sociologist in a more scientific, sociological type of way. Heschel spoke as a poet, and as a mystic also. But as Skult said, the relationship between the two is complicated and multi-layered and not easily amenable to familiar categories. Because they may be, as I sort of gave a sense of this before, that sometimes they spoke in very different language and viewed what they were saying differently, one more as sort of fact, the other more as metaphor, etc., but they might end up in the same place. So Skult's research showed that Kaplan appreciated Heschel, and he was also primarily responsible for bringing Heschel to the Jewish Theological Seminary, because if you remember, those who were here before, he originally came to HUC, the Reformed Seminary in Cincinnati, which didn't exactly work for Heschel because there were rabbis who were eating treif, and Heschel was traditionally observant. And even if Heschel wasn't a conservative rabbi, the conservative rabbis weren't eating treif. They were still traditionally observant, etc. It fit better. So Kaplan was responsible in part for bringing Heschel to JTS. And I'd forgotten about this, that Kaplan actually crafted a poem prayer based on an essay by Heschel, and I couldn't find it. I don't know why. I don't have the original prayer book, and I'll be honest, I didn't have time to sort of do the extra research to find it. But so that when Kaplan was excommunicated and his prayer book was burned by the ultra-Orthodox, since Heschel was in there too, Heschel was also, in many ways, was also excommunicated, even if it wasn't as direct. Because pretty much anybody associated with that Siddur, the original reconstruction of Siddur, was excommunicated. Not that it meant anything to any of them that they were excommunicated, because they weren't part of that world. But,
Did it happen to be called The Pious Man? Is that
I think that might be it. Do you have it?
I can include it with the recording in the email tomorrow to everyone.
Okay, great. So because I do remember seeing it, I just couldn't find it. So this is still Skult talking. Heschel appreciated Kaplan's efforts. He was unhappy with the idea that Kaplan had changed the language of some of the prayers, especially the chosenness, but also the removal of any mention of miracles, the splitting of the sea, the giving of the Torah on Sinai, things like that. Which again, a lot of those things were put back in the new reconstruction of Siddur, because by then, by the 1980s, people were, things were reconstructed even more and realized, you can say it as metaphor. You can say, the Israelites crossed the Sea of Reeds saying blah, 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 even if you don't, they didn't say blah, 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 bichamocha, I should say. Even if you didn't literally, believe it. Recommended books about Heschel. There is a biography of Heschel by Samuel Dresner, but I would say start with reading, this is a question from Becca, I would start with reading one of his, maybe an anthology of some of his works. There's stuff online, but there's also not Quest for God. I don't know if it's still in print. That's the first thing I read, and that really. So you can get his biography and more of his information, online too. But I would say Quest for God or one of the, you know, God in Search of Man is a little bit more dense, but it's also depends how much you like reading theology. Um, but also there are. I would highly recommend the video that I showed it the last time, which was with Heschel on the CBS TV show The Eternal Light. And if you Google it, you'll find it on YouTube. Um,
I'll put it in the email too.
okay, so that's a great place to start. Um, and then just the joy of the internet is you can find all other kinds of things too out there. There are videos of Susanna Heschel talking about her father. There are other people who have, other lectures by other people talking about his influence on them. His and all these wonderful quotes from his involvement in the social justice movement, civil rights movement. I can't remember. I don't think I put together a bibliography when we had the last time. But if you can be in touch with Liz, and I can always get some more information for you too. But there's a lot of stuff out there about Heschel. So interesting. So Kaplan very much his. So the language of prayer wasn't only about chosenness. This is Mel Skult. Heschel said in a letter to Kaplan that what we need is a community of kavanah, which is intention or direction, not a change in the language of prayer. Again, Heschel didn't feel, but this was because Heschel still could see prayer as metaphor, even if he was a supernaturalist, and poetry, because he was a poet. And poets understand this idea of metaphor and simile and all of that in the language. So he didn't think you needed to change the language per se. Kaplan agreed. In fact, he told his rabbinical students that Heschel was part of the answer to reconstructing traditional Judaism, and that indicates a kind of community of kavanah. So again, Kaplan didn't necessarily think for his synagogue, for his life, he wanted to change those words, but he didn't feel like everybody had to, because even Heschel's way of looking at the world was a type of reconstruction, and helped to create that community of kavanah, which he also felt was important. The difference, as I see it, in how they viewed kavanah, the intention was that with Heschel, you could use the traditional language as metaphor, as poetry, and have that intention. And Kaplan could accept that for Heschel and others, but for himself, he felt like he needed to say what he believed, and he was not comfortable using those supernatural metaphors. Nor he was also addressing other people in, especially in the upper west side of New York, but elsewhere too, intellectuals who are also saying, I can't say that anymore. It's all mumbo jumbo. It's all supernatural mumbo jumbo. It doesn't fit for us today. But Kaplan, that works for me. But Kaplan realized that both, going back to the rabbinic story, that both these and these are the words of the living God, meaning, you have two diametrically opposed beliefs or practices in some ways, and yet they can still be a way of connecting to the divine. So another major area where they differed was in terms of revelation. Okay, we're 204, we're doing fine. Okay. Luckily, there's a recording of this. I'll have to go back and listen to it and see what I said. Revelation is really important to. Um, so sorry if the rambling is too much for some. I understand that, but it's part of the difficulty of putting a lot of stuff into one session. So the revelation, for Heschel, revelation really occurred, and that's central to Heschel. That God communicated directly with the Jewish people at Sinai. It was not just a metaphor. And that was essential because it started the conversation literally for Heschel. So with Kaplan, again, it's metaphor, and actually like I said, he took some of the language out of his Siddur because even as a metaphor, it didn't work for him. So for Heschel, God isn't just concerned with human beings, but communicates directly with us. For Kaplan, and this is Mel Skulk's language, revelation is not only impossible, but it's a scandal. Kaplan says at one point that to think that the great ruler of the universe disclosed himself to one group is a sin worse than bigamy. Kaplan believed that the basic truths of religion are available to everyone. So again, first of all, so Kaplan is saying he's referring to the great ruler of the universe, even though he didn't, really believe that there was this great ruler of the universe. But to say that there is a great ruler of the universe, and that great ruler is going to talk to one specific group of people and not to anybody else, was heresy. Or as he says, sin worse than bigamy. That the truths of the world, the truths of divinity, whatever that means to you, has to be accessible to everyone, but each religion has its own unique way of accessing it. Whereas Heschel would say, as I see it, each religion has its own unique way of accessing the truths of the universe and divinity, but we as the Jewish people have a specific, unique, personal relationship with the divine that no other nation has. So again, you can see, especially in the United States, where, ideas of equality and egalitarianism and were really taking hold in the early 20th century, the early days. It's still, we're still not there yet, but this idea of both the supernatural communication between God and Israel, and the fact that God would choose Israel over all other people, just didn't fit. So Kaplan would say, yes, we do have a unique way of looking at the world. We do have a unique way of accessing divinity. We do have a unique way of making the world a better place, but it's not because God chose us over everybody else. That's one of the differences between how Heschel and Kaplan would look at things. So they were both very much concerned about the Jewish people. As I said, Kaplan saw the Jewish people as the center, as the first place you go out of that triangle of behaving, belonging, believing. It was about belonging. It was about the Jewish people. But it wasn't because God chose us. So what Skult actually says is they looked towards the same end, but used different vocabularies. Just the quote I have here from Skult again is, so Heschel lived in the realm of the ineffable, the whereas Kaplan was in the realm of the thinkable. But in the end, maybe they weren't that far apart. Heschel stated that religion was about the transformation of the individual, and this is Skull talking, and Kaplan would agree with that 100%. It's just about how you get there. So commandments is another thing. So with Kaplan, with Heschel believed, again, Heschel believed in the relationship, God spoke to us, all of that. The mitzvot, the commandments, were divinely spoken and given to the Jewish people specifically by God as the way to act in the world. Kaplan also believed that we were commanded, but we were commanded from within and not on high. That there is, or by the community. So if the community decides, that certain religious practices, they didn't exist because God commanded us to do them, but they exist because the community, for whatever reason, saw that particular practice as a way of connecting to one another and to the divine, and to make the world a better place. So again, they, as I said, in their own personal practice, they were very similar, but their beliefs and their way of praying were very different. So one thing that Skull also focuses on is, did Kaplan have much of an effect on Heschel? Because, as he did say earlier, he thought that Heschel did have some effect on Kaplan, because he was able to take the language of Heschel and the core of it and use it as metaphor and rework it a little bit for his prayer book. But he, at least from what Skull has said as Kaplan's biographer, but also knowing enough about Heschel, that Heschel didn't necessarily have Kaplan didn't really have an effect on Heschel. And I think part of it was because Kaplan was really so American in his way of thinking and his way of being, and Heschel was still very much coming from that older tradition. And it's easier to take the older tradition and then adjust it, adapt it to meet where you are now, than for Heschel to take where Kaplan is now, which is so totally different, and to try and adjust that to where he comes from. It doesn't work in reverse. You know what I'm saying? At least the way I look at it. So, and again, according to Skull, they were both very pious, but Heschel's was much more supernatural and mystical, and Kaplan's was more, again, natural or transnatural. That they were both able to see the greater, So Kaplan's piety is parallel. I'll just read the quote here. Kaplan's piety is parallel to Heschel's and might be characterized as naturalistic piety. To see the ultimate in the mundane and to live sub specie eternitatis, Latin, under the aspect of eternity, is just as available to the naturalist as to the traditional believer. So they see themselves as being part of eternity, and that they see the bigger picture, but and being part of that bigger picture, but looking at it in very different ways. Okay, just stop there for a second because I know I have been rambling a little. So, any questions or thoughts or comments at this point? Because there's so much more. I have so much more material here that I'd actually be interested if anybody here wants to share any of their thoughts in terms of how this might be, how you see yourself as fitting into this conversation here. The sort of the Kaplan versus Heschel, or like I said, I see myself. They both have affected me, and I see myself as a. I wish I knew where I put it, or if I have it somewhere in my writing somewhere. One time I wrote a piece called "Confessions of a Mystical Reconstructionist," and I don't know whatever happened to it, because I don't see the two as oppositional. I think you can, reconcile the two. So I don't know if any of you have any thoughts about, in terms of your own life, or any things that sort of struck you about all of the sort of. I appreciate you like the ramble, Joe. I know that it's not everybody's style, and I'm thinking more, this would probably be a good class to continue in the future. But any thoughts, any comments from your own perspective?
Was Heschel as anti-chosenness as Kaplan?
Oh, no, no, no.
No, that's
Heschel was very pro-chosenness.
okay.
Heschel saw our unique relationship to
Yeah.
God as being the result of being chosen.
See, that I didn't realize about him before.
And so when I talked earlier about revelation, so revelation at Sinai took place because we were chosen by God for that revelation. So that creates a unique relationship with the divine that we have because of God's choosing us. Whereas Kaplan would say, no, God doesn't choose one. Again, it's sort of blasphemous to say that God would choose one people over another.
And that's a real American influence. I can see that too.
Yes, definitely.
Others
Definitely.
very European kind of.
Yeah, yeah. Because even, it's interesting, even the liberal, if you look at the reform movement, as liberal and progressive as they are, they still maintain the language of chosenness. Because it is it is about that unique relationship between Jews and the divine, and even if they don't necessarily believe that God literally chose the Jewish people, that as a metaphor is still very powerful to pretty much all the other movements in Judaism other than the Reconstructionism, to be honest. And I know it's very interesting. I mean, I know Reconstructionists who are perfectly fine using chosenness as a metaphor. Kaplan would not be happy with that. But again, my feeling is, it's just another form of reconstructing. Because I know Reconstructionist rabbis who say the traditional blessing over the Torah, the traditional Kiddush, or whatever, and yet, as opposed to the Reconstructionist. And sometimes it's the language, too. Sometimes language has power. There's still something about the traditional Kiddush on Friday night that has a greater power for me than the Reconstructionist, but it's because that's what I grew up with. It's not because I literally believe Asher Bachar Banu, Mikol Ha'amin, that God chose us. And I'll change it, Asher Bachar Banu, in Kol Ha'amin, that God chose us with all people as opposed to from among all people, which then you sort of can have your cake and eat it too, because the language is close enough to the traditional. But that's the thing. The Reconstructionist movement. I remember when I was applying to rabbinical schools and I was applying to HUC, the Reform. I was not applying to JTS. I knew I was not a conservative rabbi. And I remember David Teutsch, who was then the dean of admissions at JTS, said to me, "Well, if you want to be a reform rabbi, go to HUC. If you want to be a rabbi and sort of figure things out for yourself, then go to RRC." Maybe a little oversimplification of it too, but. Okay, so what does it mean to be a mystical rationalist or a mystical reconstructionist? What What it means for me is I find a lot of power in the language of mysticism as metaphor, as opposed to the Hasidim or the other mystics who see it as more literal. So, like I said, I think, the example I gave before, I think is a good one in terms of, in mysticism, our doing mitzvot and our saying prayers and doing other things actually affects the divine realm. It has an effect on God. So to me, that language is saying that our individual actions as human beings or as Jews has an effect on the universe in some way, because it affects other people, not because it's going to up to God and somehow having some kind of mystical effect on God. So the language works for me, but it works for me as metaphor, or even the language, the traditional language of Revelation, of Sinai and all that, which is very mystical. Again, I take it as metaphor. So I guess in some way that's what I'm talking about. Does that make more sense? I'm
I think it was you that had told me, was it that the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College is the only rabbinical school that teaches, was it Kabbalah, or was it?
Well, it was one of no, not any, the other schools didn't. Now, I think we were the first ones to really require it, and I think it was under Art Green that really started. But now it's taught. But it was, it was taught. Heschel was a professor of mysticism, but as I mentioned last time, he was sort of persona non grata because it also did. Kaplan had a much stronger effect on a lot of that generation of rabbis to a certain extent, but mysticism wasn't seen as a. Mysticism used to be seen as a fringe movement in Judaism. It was specifically Gershon Shalom, who was the first real scholar of mysticism in the 20th century, who helped people to see that actually, no, in the early days, Kabbalah was really mainstream Judaism. But it took a while for that sort of filter down to people say, like, okay, it's not just this thing that, okay, Heschel teaches mysticism, but it's not really that important to realize, like, oh, like, if we want to understand Judaism and where it is today, we really need to understand the mystical background. Again, I don't know that, Kaplan didn't feel that way, but Art Green really had that effect on the Rabbinical College. The other thing I do want to just touch on, and this is a whole other realm, is how the two of them, how the Holocaust affected their theology. Heschel escaped. The majority of his family did not. Kaplan was here since early 20th century. Very different. Heschel saw, he felt that we had to, let me find the quotes here. Hold on a second. I do think this is, sorry, I'm just trying to scroll down here. So Heschel felt very much, so after the Holocaust, the task of being Jewish and connecting with the divine had assumed a new urgency. We are either the last, the dying Jews, or else we are those who will give new life to our tradition. So revitalization of prayer, revitalization of practice was very much against, as he said, sort of here, the part of the battle against spiritual extermination after the Holocaust. Here we go. Heschel argued that the Holocaust should move people to examine their own behavior and not that of God. So even though he believed in divine. He didn't believe that God caused the Holocaust. The question about the Auschwitz is not where was God, but where were human beings. The time has come, Heschel insisted, to heed God's call and work as God's partner in completing the work of creation. So this is very different than, say, the Satmar Hasidim, who are sort of the most right wing of the Hasidim, who believed that the Holocaust was a result of secular Zionism, that it was a punishment to the Jewish people for secular Zionism and for abandoning the tradition. Heschel would never say that. In a way, he was more of an existentialist, saying, okay, so what is the meaning we get after Auschwitz? How do we understand, where were people, not where was God? God was there with, and others would say this as well, God was within those who were trying to help and make the world better and to defeat the Nazis and to save Jews. But where were people? So it's very much a sort of, like I said, religious existentialist way of looking at it. So his quest for faith continued after the Holocaust because he didn't give up on God, whereas others did. There's a whole school of post-Holocaust theology, the whole God is dead theology and all of that, that God cannot exist after Auschwitz, the ideas of God, whereas he's saying no, because we need to look at where were people, not where was God. So Kaplan, I think that's one place where he falls short. I don't think he ever really he talked about, he looked at, sorry. Kaplan said that, events that were seen as natural evils or natural disasters have no moral weight, but he also believed that, he sort of said that, I feel like that's one area that he fell short. He still maintained a sense of optimism, which was a good thing. But, it's also interesting because his prayer book was created before the Holocaust. It really was, and then didn't get changed until the 1980s. There was not a lot in there. But my sense is that he struggled with it as a humanist, as a again, where I think he also, focused on, where were people during this time, but I don't feel like he really addressed it as powerfully as maybe Heschel did. But that's also, I think, because Heschel came from that world, and sometimes in reaction to something as powerful in a negative way as the Holocaust, I think poetry sometimes speaks louder than rationalism. And that, we could go into that in more depth, but I also just noticed that we have to sort of wrap up here. And so before we do, are there any other questions or thoughts before we wrap up? And, again, maybe we will continue this next year. Because I've as much as I've thought about the differences and similarities between them and their influence on each other and all of that, I haven't really taught that directly before. It just made me realize how much more there is to think about, and how for me personally, how each of their thought has impacted my life. I remember when I was at RSC, I used to sort of jokingly say, there were those of us who were dyed in the wool, Kaplanians and others who were more Heschelian, but the truth is it was never quite that simple, and I think pieces of both men spoke, certainly to me, but to others as well. And, I think they would both be pleased with that, because if there's one thing to remember, and I remember Ira Eisenstein saying this too, There were people who said, "Oh, they were so diametrically opposed, and they disagreed with each other, and they didn't like each other." It's like, no, they liked each other, they respected each other, and there were certain parts of each of what each one said that they could relate to, and I think they realized that they were both trying to achieve the same goal in different ways, which was bringing people back to a meaningful connection to Judaism and to Jewish peoplehood. I think that's a good place to end, unless you have any other questions. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for everything. So much research.
So much I didn't even get into, but there are also I did see there were some symposia and lectures and things like that online about Kaplan and Heschel. If you wanted to search for that, like there was like an hour and a half lecture by his daughter and then other people too. So there's a lot of stuff out there to listen to. People who know a lot more about it than I do, and who can give you a different perspectives as well.
Well, thank you so much to everybody for joining us today. Happy traveling.
Thank you. Thank you.
Enjoy. And thank you everyone for being here today.
All right. Take care, everyone.